Hi everybody, this is Katya Eckhart. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This evening I'm wearing a striped dress that I've worn before together with my fishnet stockings and my woven high heels. So this is kind of an autumnal look that I wanted to share. We're having some beautiful weather here in the desert southwest. Our temperatures have cooled off. It's still really starting to feel like autumn. So I just wanted to share that information with you. But this evening I'm going to go back to Nietzsche. And what I want to do this evening is just a number of things kind of to wrap this up. I want to discuss this kind of systematic connection that I see among various philosophical doctrines or ideas that Nietzsche has. His perfectionism, the notion of the Übermensch or the Superman, the notion of the eternal return, and also finally the will to power. So I want to do basically two things in this video this evening, and I hope you'll find it interesting. What I want to do is, first of all, describe the systematic connections among these doctrines, how they all kind of fit together. And then I want to conclude by saying that they basically rest upon unproven assumptions, that they really haven't been sufficiently justified, and that represents a problem for Nietzsche's philosophy in the bigger picture, but I want to make a qualification to that at the very end. So let's get right down to business and just remind ourselves of kind of what the state of play is in connection with this very interesting and influential philosophical position. There are many different interpretations of it, so this is my interpretation, but I encourage you to consider other possibilities. In any event, what's important to recognize is that Nietzsche is a perfectionist. He wants to attain perfection. He wants his readers, some of them, to attain a certain kind of perfection. And he identifies this perfection or describes it in terms of the so-called Übermensch, that's the Superman or the superperson. This is someone who has transcended traditional and probably any kind of morality, someone who is completely self-possessed and is very strong, very powerful, and very proactive. Now, the problem that immediately confronts this is, on the one hand, Nietzsche criticizes any kind of weakness, whether it be illness or infirmity or ignorance or even ugliness. He talks about Socrates being ugly. Any kind of weakness or infirmity he takes to be a very strong sign that someone is an autant in German, that means degenerate. And degeneracy is obviously totally incompatible with perfection. Now, what is the problem? And I've mentioned this before, but I want to briefly summarize it briefly once again. The problem is that when we look at that, just about anybody at some point in his or her life suffers from some kind of weakness or infirmity of the various types that I just mentioned. So if we really take that seriously, then it seems like nobody could ever really be an Übermensch. Nobody really ever has been. It's probably very, very difficult for somebody to do that, to attain this very high level of perfection, given that each one of us at some point is subject to some kind of infirmity, and indeed Nietzsche himself spent the last 11 years of his life or so completely insane, maybe because he contracted syphilis or some other ailment, but once again, that would be an indication of degeneracy, so that would prevent even Nietzsche from becoming an Übermensch. So this is the kind of initial problem that arises in connection with these two views coming together, the Übermensch idea of perfection, and then the fact of degeneracy is being indicated by various kinds of infirmity from which just about everybody, if not everyone, at some point suffers. So how does Nietzsche, or how might Nietzsche, circumvent this problem? Now, it's at this point, I think, that the eternal return becomes very, very important. This is something that I've talked about before. And so the idea is that if somebody is willing to say yes to an infinite repetition of life that is in both directions. In other words, if somebody is willing to look at life and say, well, look, this has occurred infinitely many times in the past, and it will recur again infinitely many times in the future, no matter what happens in my life, no matter how good it is or bad it is, no matter what infirmities may come along at some point or what have you, if I am willing to say yes to all of that, then my yes will also be something that I have said infinitely many times in the past, and it will be something that I say infinitely many times in the future, and that would give me some very powerful evidence, Nietzsche thinks, that I am an Übermensch, even though my life may be characterized at times by weakness of various kinds. Because in spite of all that, I am willing to say yes to my life, in this infinite repetition of my life. So that's where I think the notion of the eternal return comes in at a very key point in Nietzsche's thought. He needs that as a kind of test to determine whether one really is an Übermensch, even though one suffers from weakness at some point in one's life. Now, is it simply a test? Is it simply something, well, look, this is kind of a thought experiment. It isn't really the case that one's life has infinitely occurred infinitely many times in the past and will infinitely recur in the future. This is just kind of an imaginative thought construct or a thought experiment that Nietzsche conducts. Well, look, if I can imagine, well, what would it be like if my life were like that? And would I be willing to accept it? If I would say yes to that, then I would be an Übermensch, even though I don't have to believe that as a matter of metaphysical fact, that's actually happened. And there are ways of reading Nietzsche like that. I don't agree with them, and I'll tell you why I don't. Again, it goes back to this notion of perfection that Nietzsche is trying to develop. And there's a connection between Nietzsche, it seems to me on this point, and a medieval philosopher theologian named St. Anselm. So St. Anselm, to just paraphrase this idea very briefly, St. Anselm thinks, and I think he's correct about this, he thinks that something is more perfect if it actually exists in reality than if it exists merely in the mind, merely as a concept or as a thought. And so he uses this to try to prove that God exists with this very famous ontological argument. Infamous, some people would say, because it's very controversial whether or not it works. Now let's put that to one side. It still seems to me that the root idea here is correct. And that is that, well, look, if I'm thinking about a beautiful golden mountain, well, it's going to be more perfect if it actually exists in reality than if it's simply some kind of an idea in my mind. I would then apply the same point to this notion of the eternal return. An eternal return of my life is something that's happened infinitely many times in the past and will recur infinitely many times in the future, is going to be more perfect, and my saying yes to that is going to be more perfect if that's not simply some kind of thought construct on my part, but actually exists in reality as a metaphysical fact, as a cosmological truth. And so I think in order for Nietzsche to attain this kind of this perfectionism that he believes in, the eternal repetition, the eternal recurrence had better be true, not simply something that we imagine, but something that's actually true. Now, let me move towards the end of my comments this evening by pointing out a problem. And that is that, well, suppose that this really is a truth. Well, there are two possible scenarios here that still haven't really been separated, and we're not really sure which one obtains. One possibility is that if I'm thinking about my life and all the things that happen in it, including the weaknesses, and my saying yes to that, it could be that my life literally repeats itself over and over again. Or it could be something else, which is, well, it's not actually my life that repeats infinitely many times. It's like there are infinitely many duplicates that occur. In other words, each time there's a life like that, it's not one and the same life that's being repeated. It's like a bunch of identical twins, right? And so what we have are not infinitely many repetitions of one and the same life with me in it. What we have are infinitely many duplications of different lives, ontologically distinct lives, with people like me in them who are exact duplicates of one another or counterparts of one another, but they aren't the same person. Now, if I say yes to that, well, that doesn't prove any perfection about me, because I'm not really saying yes to a repetition, an infinite repetition of my own life, despite the weaknesses that may occur in it. I'm saying yes to a bunch of infinite duplicates, that not all of which, in fact, only one of which has something to do with me, and so that really wouldn't be an infinite repetition of my life. That's what Nietzsche needs in order to attain this very high level of perfection that I've been talking about. Now finally, this is where I think the other doctrine that's crucial to Nietzsche's philosophy comes into the picture. Excuse me, I have to adjust something here. And that is the idea of the will to power. Now, the notion of the will to power, it seems to me, has to do with this kind of abstract willing that is at the very heart of reality. It's not just my will or your will or any one individual's will or collective will. It's sort of an abstract force or a power at the very heart of the cosmos that wills itself to expression and that can will itself through us. It's almost like when it rains and the water comes down and then it flows into all these channels and currents. The rainstorm is like this powerful, the rainfall is like this very powerful phenomenon that sort of comes to expression through these various rivulets, but it's one and the same phenomenon. And so Nietzsche's kind of thinking about the will to power, it seems to me, especially in his later philosophy, in these terms. It sort of occurs through us in this self-expression. Now, what I think is important here, one way that Nietzsche might say that, well, look, what's happening here is not that we have infinitely many duplicates that occur, that are exactly resemble each other but are different ontologically. We have one and the same will that repeats itself over and over again through these various conditions. And it's sort of like the sun, one and the same sun rising infinitely many times in the past and infinitely many times in the future, over and over and over again. It's not like we have a bunch of duplicate suns, infinitely many. It's that we have only one that repeats itself over and over again. And it does so under various conditions, like its color, its yellowness, its huge size, its shape, its heat, and so forth. And so we're sort of like, or if I'm an Übermensch that says yes to that, then I participate in this eternal recurrence of one and the same will over and over and over again, and I am among the conditions of its appearance, just like yellowness and brownness are among the conditions of the appearance of the sun if it rises infinitely many times over and over again. So so if I say yes to that, then I have very good reason, Nietzsche might argue, to think that I'm part of that, and that means I would be an Übermensch insofar as I am among the conditions of appearance of this eternally recurring, abstract, primal will at the heart of reality, something that Schopenhauer, another philosopher, also thinks is the case. Something like that is true. But whereas Schopenhauer wants to free himself from this kind of abstract willing, Nietzsche embraces it because he thinks that's the essence of life. It's a good thing, and you want to be a part of it. You don't want to check out from it or get away from it or turn away from it or reject it. So that's what I think. Now, finally, look at all the things that Nietzsche has to take on, though, in this position in order to make it all work out, in order to make everything hang together, as it were. First of all, there has to be this abstract willing at the heart of the cosmos. Secondly, the conditions of its appearance, these properties through which it occurs, these conditions through which it occurs, they're not different. They're like one and the same thing, like the yellowness of the sun that rises over and over again. Each time it's one and the same yellowness. It's not different yellownesses each time. It's one and the same property that occurs or is instantiated infinitely many times by one and the same will. Similarly, the space and time in which this occurs, it seems to me that too has to be among the conditions, absorbed into the conditions of this eternal recurrence. It's almost like there's really only one thing that really exists. That's the eternally recurring will to power, with these conditions that are kind of like properties understood in a sort of universalist way, not as particular tropes or properties, property instances, but one and the same property that's instantiated over and over again by this abstract will to power. Now, maybe that works out, and maybe it doesn't work out. But whichever way that goes, I don't think it's good for Nietzsche on one level. And let me say what that is finally. I don't think it's good because Nietzsche doesn't really prove any of this stuff. He may need it in order to make sense out of the notion of the Übermensch and the eternal return as a return as opposed to an eternal duplication, but he doesn't really do all the metaphysical work that I've sketched just now, and B, he doesn't really prove it to be true. Yes, there are a couple of arguments that he gives at some point, but they don't really seem very persuasive, and they don't come anywhere near the kind of detail that I've just been going through. That's what he's going to need to do in order to substantiate this thesis of the eternal return grounded in the will to power, making sense out of the Übermensch as an expression of Nietzschean perfectionism. To put it in a nutshell, he's going to need to do that. Now, lastly, I think that we need to separate two things when we think about Nietzsche's philosophy, the positive and the negative. And the negative is in a way more valuable. That's where Nietzsche's not trying to prove anything, per se, and I've talked about this a little bit before. He's not trying to prove anything, but he's trying to raise certain skeptical possibilities against metaphysical positions, against theological positions, and I've discussed that before. I won't get into that again this evening. So that's the sort of, well, what if this were the case, how can you rule that out? If you can't rule that out, then why are you entitled to this alternative theological or metaphysical explanation that's incompatible with the possibility, the skeptical counter-possibility that I, Nietzsche, have raised? You haven't done that, and so until you do that, your position is not really justified. It's not phenomenologically or experientially or epistemologically grounded. Now that's where I think Nietzsche is on firmer ground, and I think he could be more helpful in that he goads us to try to address that problem. I think where Nietzsche gets into trouble, though, is in his more positive philosophy, and that's all the metaphysical stuff that I've been talking about this evening, which he never really develops, and he certainly never really proves. So that is my Katja Eckhart's take on Nietzsche's philosophy in 20 minutes or less. And there's a lot more that could be said about this. I certainly don't claim to know everything about it, but I think it's interesting, and I believe my own thinking about this material has become clearer over the last few weeks and months. Sometimes you have to walk away from something and think about it, and and then come back to it later, and walk away from it and not think about it at all, and then come back to it later, and then you might have some insights or be able to express it more clearly. But anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about this evening. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for spending a little time with me this evening. I wish everybody a safe and a restful and a relaxing good night. As always, be good to each other. Take care of each other. I care for all of you. Until next time, this is Katja Eckhart saying goodbye. Thanks again for joining me.